Before you decide who someone is, ask yourself how much of their story you actually know. The words lingered in the quiet afternoon air just as three dark government vehicles rolled silently toward the downtown Houston Police Department. Their polished black exteriors reflected the golden sunlight stretching across the busy street, but no flashing lights announced their arrival. No sirens disturbed the city. The convoy moved with calm precision, drawing curious glances from pedestrians who had no idea why military officials were suddenly heading toward an ordinary police station. Inside the building, Margaret Johnson sat alone in a modest interview room, completely unaware that an entire chain of events had quietly begun because of her. At 64 years old, Margaret had never expected an ordinary Wednesday to end this way. Resting gently across her lap was a bouquet of fresh white lilies wrapped in brown paper, the flowers she purchased every year before visiting her late husband's grave at the Houston National Cemetery. She carefully adjusted one folded corner of the wrapping, making certain no delicate petals had been damaged during the long afternoon. To anyone passing the open doorway, she appeared less like someone involved in an investigation and more like a grandmother patiently waiting for an overdue appointment. Her calm expression never changed. She believed that truth did not become stronger because someone spoke louder. It simply waited until people were ready to see it. Only a few hours earlier, her day had begun exactly as it always did. She left her modest brick home shortly after sunrise, watered the flowers growing beside her front porch, and stopped at the neighborhood florist where the owner had greeted her by name after nearly 20 years of friendship. Margaret smiled warmly, thanked him for choosing the freshest lilies in the shop, and continued toward downtown before planning to visit the cemetery later that afternoon. The weather was perfect. Bright blue skies stretched above Houston while warm sunlight reflected from towering office buildings. Families filled the sidewalks, food vendors welcomed lunchtime crowds, and business professionals hurried through intersections carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Nothing suggested that the ordinary rhythm of the city would soon change. Then she heard a frightened child crying. Near one of the busiest crosswalks, a little girl no older than 6 stood frozen beside the curb, tears running down her cheeks while desperately searching the crowd for her parents. Hundreds of strangers walked past without noticing. Margaret immediately stopped. She slowly knelt several feet away, introduced herself in a gentle voice, and promised the little girl they would find her family together. She never rushed toward the child. She simply remained nearby, speaking calmly while making certain the frightened girl stayed safely away from moving traffic. Within minutes, several people noticed the unusual scene. Unfortunately, not everyone witnessed the beginning. One passerby believed the elderly woman was rescuing the child. Another assumed something suspicious had happened. Someone else called emergency services after reporting an unidentified woman standing beside a crying little girl near a crowded intersection. Patrol officers arrived quickly, responding to incomplete information during a day when city security had already been heightened because of a nationally significant military ceremony scheduled only a few miles away. Questions came rapidly. Witnesses interrupted one another. Cell phones appeared before facts did. Margaret answered every question politely and willingly agreed to accompany officers while everything was clarified, believing the misunderstanding would soon disappear. She never realized that her cellular telephone remained on silent inside her handbag. One missed call quietly appeared across the screen, then another, then another. Each call came from her only son, General Ethan Johnson, a 5-star military leader who had never once begun an important ceremony without first hearing his mother's voice. Outside the police station, the dark government convoy completed its silent arrival beneath the warm evening sky while inside, Margaret continued protecting the bouquet of white lilies, still believing the only promise she needed to keep before sunset was placing those flowers beside the man who had taught her that dignity should always come before recognition. The interview room remained almost perfectly still as the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the polished wooden table where Margaret Johnson continued protecting the bouquet of white lilies resting gently in her lap. Every few minutes she carefully adjusted the brown paper wrapping, making certain the delicate petals remained fresh for the promise she still hoped to keep before sunset. The quiet surrounding her felt strangely comforting. Beyond the closed door, officers moved through the station carrying reports, answering telephones, and responding to routine calls across Houston. Inside the room, however, time seemed to move much more slowly. Margaret had lived long enough to understand that some situations could not be hurried. Truth, much like trust, arrived only after people chose to look carefully. Her thoughts drifted back to the modest brick house where she had raised her family with her late husband, Master Sergeant Charles Johnson. Their home had never been large, but it had always been filled with laughter, discipline, and quiet faith. Charles often reminded their young son that a person's greatest title would never appear on a uniform. Character was earned through everyday choices made when no one else was watching. Margaret carried those words with her long after Charles passed away. Every Tuesday she prepared breakfast for elderly veterans at the neighborhood church. Every Thursday she organized donated clothing for struggling families. On weekends she read stories to children at the public library because she believed every child deserved someone willing to listen. Very few people knew anything about her family. She never mentioned her son's military career because she wanted every act of kindness to stand on its own instead of borrowing importance from someone else's accomplishments. Across the hallway, Sergeant Brian Walker quietly reviewed the growing collection of witness statements gathered from downtown. One report described an elderly woman calmly reassuring a frightened little girl while keeping her safely away from traffic. Another came from a nearby restaurant employee who watched Margaret patiently remain beside the child until help arrived. Security camera footage had also begun arriving from surrounding businesses. Walker studied each recording carefully. Every angle showed the same thing. Margaret had never attempted to leave with the child. She had never acted aggressively. She had simply stayed close enough to comfort a little girl who believed she had been left completely alone. Officer Melissa Grant entered carrying another folder along with a fresh cup of coffee. She placed both on Walker's desk before quietly explaining that the little girl's mother had already visited the station to express gratitude toward Margaret for protecting her daughter. Melissa admitted she could not understand why the elderly woman remained inside the interview room when every available piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Walker looked toward the surveillance monitor replaying the downtown scene. He slowly realized that uncertainty, crowded sidewalks, overlapping witness accounts, and heightened security surrounding the military ceremony had created a situation where assumptions had spread faster than facts. The evidence had not changed. Only people's understanding of it had. Several miles away inside the George R. Brown Convention Center, General Ethan Johnson stood beneath enormous American flags while military officials finalized preparations for the evening ceremony. Television crews adjusted cameras. Distinguished guests filled reserved seating. Military bands quietly rehearsed patriotic music echoing through the grand hall. Yet Ethan found himself looking repeatedly toward his cellular telephone. His mother had never missed an important day in his life. Not his graduation from West Point. Not his first promotion. Not the ceremony where he accepted his current command. Concern slowly replaced confidence. He quietly instructed his executive aide to continue searching every possible location before the program began. Back inside the interview room, Margaret finally noticed the growing list of missed calls waiting silently on her telephone screen. A gentle smile crossed her face when she recognized her son's name. Instead of calling immediately, she slipped the phone back into her handbag. She did not want him distracted from his responsibilities because of what she still believed was only a temporary misunderstanding. Outside the station, the warm Texas sunlight gradually softened toward evening while the first secure telephone call from military headquarters quietly reached the commander's office, carrying information that would soon transform an ordinary misunderstanding into a lesson no one inside the building would ever forget. Sergeant Brian Walker leaned back slowly in his chair as the final surveillance recording finished playing across the computer monitor. Outside his office window, downtown Houston continued moving with its usual energy. Office workers hurried toward parking garages, buses pulled away from crowded stops, and the warm Texas sun reflected from towering glass buildings stretching across the skyline. Inside the precinct, however, the atmosphere had begun to change. Every new piece of information quietly reinforced the same conclusion. Margaret Johnson had never placed the little girl in danger. She had been the person who prevented danger from finding her. Walker replayed the footage one final time. The security camera overlooking the busy intersection showed Margaret stopping immediately after hearing the frightened child cry. She remained several feet away, speaking softly while encouraging the little girl to stay safely on the sidewalk. At no point did she attempt to lead the child away. She simply stayed nearby until help arrived. Moments later, the little girl's mother appeared running through the crowd with panic written across her face. Before officers even reached the scene, she embraced her daughter, then turned toward Margaret with unmistakable gratitude. Even though the security camera captured no sound, the mother's repeated words of thanks were obvious from her expression alone. Walker quietly lowered his eyes. The truth had been visible from the beginning. It had simply arrived too slowly to compete with hurried assumptions made during a crowded afternoon. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Officer Melissa Grant stepped into the office carrying another folder filled with updated witness interviews. She explained that 2 additional business owners overlooking the intersection had independently confirmed Margaret's account. Both described her as calm, patient, and focused entirely upon comforting the frightened child. Neither witness reported anything suspicious. Melissa hesitated before adding that the little girl's parents had asked whether they could personally thank Margaret before she left the station. Walker nodded thoughtfully but did not answer immediately. He understood that the investigation had effectively reached its conclusion. What remained unresolved had nothing to do with evidence. It involved recognizing how quickly incomplete information could shape confident decisions. Across the city, inside the secure preparation suite beneath the convention center, General Ethan Johnson stood quietly before a large window overlooking rows of American flags waving across the outdoor plaza. Military bands rehearsed in the distance while distinguished guests continued taking their seats for the evening ceremony. His executive aide approached with a concerned expression and quietly reported that military liaison officers had finally established contact with local authorities. Although details remained limited, they had confirmed that Margaret Johnson was safe. Ethan closed his eyes briefly in visible relief before thanking the aide. He immediately requested transportation to the precinct, explaining that the ceremony could wait a few more minutes if necessary. Family came before recognition. Back inside the Houston Police Department, the station commander answered a secure telephone line reserved for interagency communications. His expression gradually shifted as the caller carefully verified Margaret's identity using details unavailable to the public. Her date of birth. Her address. The flowers she carried every year to her late husband's grave. Every answer matched perfectly. When the conversation ended, the commander remained silent for several seconds before opening the personnel door and calling Sergeant Walker into his office. Without speaking, he slid a color photograph across the polished desk. It showed General Ethan Johnson standing proudly beside an elderly woman holding a bouquet of white lilies at a military memorial several years earlier. Walker immediately recognized the gentle smile. It was exactly the same smile Margaret had worn throughout the entire afternoon while patiently answering every question placed before her. At that exact moment, Margaret quietly sat alone inside the interview room, carefully straightening one slightly bent lily petal as the warm evening sunlight drifted across the wooden table. She never looked toward the hallway. She never imagined that outside the station, a line of dark government vehicles had already begun turning through the entrance gates, carrying people who finally understood that the quiet woman waiting inside deserved respect long before anyone discovered the remarkable family she had quietly shaped through a lifetime of compassion. The station commander's office fell completely silent after the secure telephone call ended. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Outside the large office window, the warm Texas sun continued sinking toward the horizon, casting long golden reflections across the parking lot where three dark government vehicles had quietly come to a stop beneath the station entrance. Their arrival had attracted attention without creating panic. Officers walking through the lobby instinctively slowed their pace. Administrative staff exchanged uncertain glances before returning to their work. No one knew exactly why military officials had arrived, but everyone sensed that the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon had quietly changed. Sergeant Brian Walker stood motionless beside the commander's desk while the printed photograph remained between them. It showed General Ethan Johnson standing proudly beside his mother during a Veterans Day ceremony several years earlier. Margaret's gentle smile was unmistakable. The bouquet of white lilies resting in her hands looked almost identical to the flowers she now carried only a few doors away inside the interview room. Walker lowered his eyes, replaying every conversation from the afternoon in his mind. He remembered how patiently Margaret had answered every question. He remembered her thanking officers for treating the frightened little girl with kindness. He remembered that she had apologized for taking up their time even though every piece of evidence now confirmed she had done nothing except help a lost child. The uncomfortable truth settled heavily across his thoughts. Nothing about the evidence had changed. Only his understanding had. The commander quietly closed the investigative file before speaking in a calm voice. He reminded Walker that professionalism was measured not by pretending mistakes never happened but by responding honorably after discovering them. Walker nodded slowly. He understood exactly what the commander meant. Outside the office, Officer Melissa Grant gently knocked on the interview room door before stepping inside with a fresh bottle of water. Margaret thanked her warmly and accepted it with the same quiet smile she had offered everyone throughout the afternoon. The bouquet of lilies remained carefully protected across her lap. Melissa hesitated for a brief moment before asking whether the flowers were for someone special. Margaret's expression softened with quiet affection. She explained that they were for her late husband, who had served his country proudly for many years before passing away. Every spring she visited his grave on the same day, at nearly the same hour, because promises made from love deserved to be kept regardless of how many years had passed. Melissa smiled gently, wishing her a peaceful visit once everything had been resolved. Across the city, General Ethan Johnson's government sedan moved steadily through evening traffic beneath a sky painted with warm shades of orange and gold. Although several military escorts surrounded the vehicle, Ethan remained focused on only one thought. His mother had always taught him that leadership began with humility long before authority. As the buildings of downtown Houston reflected the fading sunlight, he quietly removed the speech prepared for the evening ceremony and folded it closed without reading another page. There would be time for speeches later. Right now, he simply wanted to make certain his mother was safe. Back inside the precinct, Margaret finally stood and gently smoothed the front of her navy cardigan before lifting the bouquet into her arms once again. She glanced toward the interview room window where the last rays of daylight illuminated the delicate white petals. She quietly hoped there would still be enough time to reach the cemetery before sunset. She never imagined that only a few steps away, the front entrance had just opened as military liaison officers entered the station with calm professionalism, carrying nothing except official identification and a simple request to meet the remarkable woman whose quiet dignity had already begun changing every heart inside the building long before anyone recognized the extraordinary family she had quietly shaped through a lifetime of kindness. The military liaison officers entered the precinct with calm professionalism, their polished uniforms reflecting the last rays of the Texas sunset that streamed through the tall glass entrance. They carried no visible urgency, only quiet purpose. Every officer in the lobby instinctively stepped aside, sensing that something significant had unfolded beyond the walls of the station. Sergeant Brian Walker watched them approach the commander's office while his thoughts remained fixed on the elderly woman waiting patiently only a few yards away. He could not stop replaying the security footage in his mind. Margaret Johnson had never argued. She had never raised her voice. She had never attempted to defend herself with anger or influence. She had simply trusted that the truth would eventually become visible. That quiet confidence now felt far more powerful than anything written inside the investigation file resting beneath his hand. The military liaison presented official identification before speaking in a respectful tone. He confirmed once again that General Ethan Johnson had already left the convention center after learning where his mother had been located. The evening ceremony had been temporarily adjusted, not because of military protocol, but because the son refused to begin one of the most important moments of his career until he personally knew his mother was safe. The commander thanked the liaison and quietly closed the folder containing Margaret's case. Every question had now been answered. Every witness statement matched the surveillance recordings. The child's parents had personally confirmed that Margaret's only concern had been protecting their daughter until they arrived. There was no uncertainty remaining. Outside the office, Officer Melissa Grant gently opened the interview room door once more. Margaret looked up from the bouquet of white lilies resting across her lap and smiled with the same warmth she had offered every person she met throughout the afternoon. Melissa softly explained that everything had finally been clarified and that the investigation was complete. Margaret thanked her kindly, gathered the bouquet into her arms, and stood slowly. Before leaving the room, she paused for a brief moment to smooth one folded corner of the paper wrapping around the flowers. The gesture seemed so ordinary, yet everyone watching understood that she had spent the entire afternoon protecting those lilies because they represented a promise made many years earlier. As Margaret stepped into the hallway, Sergeant Brian Walker approached her with measured steps. His usual confidence had disappeared, replaced by sincere humility. He looked directly into her eyes and quietly admitted that the investigation should have reached the truth much sooner. He acknowledged that the evidence had supported her account almost from the beginning, yet assumptions and pressure had delayed what should have been obvious. Margaret listened without interruption. Her expression remained calm, thoughtful, and compassionate. After a moment of quiet reflection, she answered softly that every difficult day gave people an opportunity to choose what kind of person they wished to become tomorrow. She explained that mistakes did not define someone's character nearly as much as their willingness to learn from them. Walker lowered his head slightly, understanding that her words carried no accusation, only grace. At that very moment, the sound of another government sedan entered the parking lot outside. Through the wide lobby windows, several officers saw General Ethan Johnson step from the vehicle wearing his immaculate formal military uniform. The fading golden sunlight reflected from the polished insignia across his shoulders as he paused briefly near the entrance, taking one steady breath before walking toward the station doors. Inside the lobby, conversations quietly faded into silence. Margaret remained unaware that her son had already reached the building. She simply adjusted the bouquet one final time and looked toward the exit, still believing that if she left quickly enough, she might yet place the white lilies beside her late husband's memorial before the last light disappeared beyond the Houston skyline. The lobby settled into an almost reverent silence as the station doors remained closed for one brief, suspended moment. No one seemed eager to interrupt it. The warm glow of the Texas sunset streamed through the glass entrance, bathing the polished floor in soft shades of gold that stretched toward Margaret Johnson's shoes. She stood quietly holding the bouquet of white lilies against her chest, unaware that every person in the room had begun seeing her through entirely different eyes. Only a few hours earlier, she had been an unfamiliar face surrounded by uncertainty. Now, after every witness statement had been confirmed and every security recording carefully reviewed, the uncertainty had disappeared. What remained was a quiet realization that kindness had been standing in front of them from the very beginning. Sergeant Brian Walker remained motionless for several seconds after speaking with Margaret. Her gentle words continued echoing inside his thoughts. She had not asked who would be held responsible. She had not questioned departmental procedures. She had not suggested that anyone deserved punishment. Instead, she spoke only about choosing to become better after discovering the truth. That unexpected grace weighed far more heavily upon him than criticism ever could have. He slowly turned toward the station window overlooking the parking lot where the government vehicles rested beneath the fading evening sky. The last light reflected across their windshields like calm waves, reminding him how quickly appearances could deceive. Inside the interview room only minutes earlier, Margaret had carefully protected a simple bouquet of flowers while officers protected procedures. Somewhere between those two priorities, they had almost forgotten to see the person standing quietly before them. Officer Melissa Grant gently approached Margaret once more and asked whether she needed anything before leaving the station. Margaret smiled warmly and thanked her for the water she had brought earlier. She explained that she already had everything she needed. Melissa looked curiously toward the lilies and quietly asked whether she still planned to visit the cemetery despite the late hour. Margaret answered without hesitation. She said that promises made from love deserved to be honored whenever possible, even if the sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon. Her voice remained soft, but every word carried the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping commitments that no one else ever noticed. Across the city, the evening ceremony had become noticeably quieter than originally planned. Guests waited patiently while military officials adjusted the schedule with remarkable professionalism. General Ethan Johnson remained inside the government sedan as it completed the final blocks toward the precinct. He watched Houston pass slowly beyond the window, remembering countless childhood evenings riding beside his parents through those same streets. His mother had always pointed toward strangers who quietly helped others and reminded him that true greatness rarely announced itself. It simply appeared whenever compassion became more important than convenience. Those lessons had shaped every command he had ever accepted. Back inside the precinct, the station commander quietly gathered the officers who had participated in the afternoon investigation. He spoke calmly, reminding them that public trust depended not only upon making difficult decisions but also upon possessing the humility to correct them when new facts emerged. No one argued. Every face reflected thoughtful silence instead of defensiveness. Brian Walker looked toward the hallway where Margaret waited peacefully with the bouquet still resting in her hands. He realized that the greatest lesson of the day had not been delivered inside a classroom, a courtroom, or a training academy. It had been demonstrated by an ordinary woman who refused to surrender her dignity even when circumstances invited frustration. Just beyond the glass entrance, a familiar figure stepped out of the waiting sedan and paused briefly beneath the warm evening light. Inside the lobby, no one had yet spoken his name, but every heartbeat seemed to slow as quiet footsteps approached the station doors, carrying with them the moment that would forever separate misunderstanding from truth. The glass entrance opened slowly, and the quiet that settled across the Houston Police Department seemed deeper than silence itself. Every conversation stopped. Every telephone suddenly felt distant. Officers instinctively looked toward the doorway as General Ethan Johnson stepped inside wearing his immaculate formal military dress uniform, the polished stars on his shoulders catching the last rays of the evening sun. He did not enter with the commanding presence of the nation's highest military leadership. He entered as a son searching for his mother. His expression carried neither anger nor accusation. It carried only concern. Margaret Johnson turned gently toward the entrance, still holding the bouquet of white lilies against her chest. The moment her eyes met Ethan's, the tension that had quietly surrounded the station throughout the afternoon seemed to disappear. A warm smile spread across her face, the same smile that had encouraged him before every difficult chapter of his life. Ethan crossed the polished lobby with calm, measured steps until he stood only a few inches from her. Neither of them spoke immediately. Words felt unnecessary. The silence itself carried decades of trust, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Finally, Ethan asked the only question that had mattered since he realized she had disappeared. He quietly asked whether she was all right. Margaret answered with the same gentle confidence that had guided him since childhood. She assured him she was perfectly fine and reminded him that sometimes patience reached the truth before worry ever could. Ethan smiled softly before embracing his mother with great care, making certain not to crush the white lilies she still carried so protectively. Around them, every officer remained perfectly still. Sergeant Brian Walker lowered his eyes, realizing that the most powerful person entering the station had not demanded authority, recognition, or explanations. Instead, the general's first concern had been his mother's well-being. When the embrace ended, Ethan turned respectfully toward the officers gathered nearby. He thanked them sincerely for ensuring his mother remained safe while the misunderstanding was investigated. His words surprised everyone. No criticism followed. No request for special treatment came. He calmly explained that every profession occasionally faced moments where incomplete information complicated difficult decisions. What truly defined honorable service, he said, was the willingness to recognize the truth once it became clear. Sergeant Brian Walker slowly stepped forward. His voice remained steady, though filled with genuine humility. He admitted that every reliable piece of evidence had supported Margaret's account almost from the very beginning. He confessed that assumptions had briefly become louder than careful observation, and for that he offered his sincere apology. Margaret listened quietly before placing one gentle hand upon his forearm. She smiled warmly and told him that forgiveness always accomplished more than resentment. She explained that every person made mistakes, but only people of real character chose to learn from them instead of defending them. Walker nodded silently, understanding that those simple words would remain with him for the rest of his career. Ethan then looked around the lobby one final time before speaking again. He explained that his mother's dignity had never depended upon his military rank. She had earned respect long before anyone knew his name because she had spent her entire life serving others without expecting recognition. If there was one lesson worth remembering from that afternoon, he said softly, it was that every stranger deserved fairness before anyone discovered their accomplishments. The station commander quietly removed his cap in respect. Several younger officers exchanged thoughtful glances while administrative staff stood silently behind their desks. No applause filled the room. None was needed. The truth had already spoken clearly enough. Margaret gently adjusted the bouquet one last time before looking toward the front entrance. The evening sky beyond the glass had turned deep shades of orange and gold. She smiled at her son and softly reminded him that his father had been waiting patiently for those flowers all day. Ethan returned her smile and quietly offered his arm. Together they began walking toward the fading sunlight while every person inside the station instinctively stepped aside, not because they were honoring military authority, but because they had just witnessed the quiet strength of an ordinary woman whose compassion had transformed an entire afternoon into a lesson about dignity, humility, and humanity that none of them would ever forget. The drive to Houston National Cemetery unfolded beneath a sky painted with soft shades of amber and crimson as the final light of day settled across the quiet city. Neither Margaret Johnson nor General Ethan Johnson felt any need to fill the peaceful silence between them. The bouquet of white lilies rested carefully across Margaret's lap exactly as it had throughout the long afternoon, every delicate petal still untouched despite the unexpected journey. She occasionally glanced through the window as familiar neighborhoods passed by, remembering the countless evenings she and Charles had driven those same roads together after church, after community dinners, and after volunteer work helping families who needed a little hope. Their lives had never been extraordinary in the eyes of the world, yet they had always believed that ordinary kindness could quietly change someone else's tomorrow. When the government sedan entered the cemetery gates, the surrounding world seemed to slow even further. Rows of white memorial stones stretched peacefully across the gently rolling landscape while enormous American flags moved softly in the warm Texas breeze. The fading sunlight reflected across polished granite, bathing the entire cemetery in a quiet golden glow that felt almost timeless. Margaret stepped out of the vehicle first, gently lifting the bouquet into her arms. Ethan walked beside her, carrying his service cap respectfully in one hand instead of placing it back upon his head. Neither military rank nor official ceremony mattered here. They were simply a wife honoring her husband and a son honoring his father. They followed the familiar pathway until Charles Johnson's memorial came into view. Margaret smiled softly before kneeling carefully beside the polished stone. She placed the white lilies exactly where she had promised she would every year, gently straightening the ribbon before resting her fingertips against the cool granite. Ethan remained standing a few feet behind her with his head lowered, allowing his mother those quiet moments that belonged only to her. The evening breeze carried the gentle sound of rustling leaves through the rows of memorials, and for several peaceful minutes neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret looked toward the engraved name before quietly saying that Charles would probably smile if he knew how the day had ended. Not because of military recognition or official apologies, but because people had chosen understanding after discovering the truth. Ethan smiled gently and answered that his father had always believed real victories happened inside the human heart long before anyone noticed them. Margaret slowly stood and looked toward her son with warm pride. She reminded him that everything he had accomplished began long before uniforms, ceremonies, and promotions. It began at the family dinner table where respect was expected, honesty was practiced, and compassion was never considered a weakness. Ethan nodded quietly. He admitted that every difficult decision he had ever made throughout his military career had been guided far more by his parents than by any academy or battlefield. As they walked back toward the waiting vehicle, they noticed a single fresh white flower resting quietly beside another nearby memorial. There was no name attached to it and no indication of who had placed it there. Margaret smiled gently, believing someone else had chosen to remember a loved one with the same quiet devotion. She never realized that Sergeant Brian Walker had visited the cemetery only minutes earlier after finishing his shift, carrying that single flower as a silent promise to become the kind of officer who listened before judging and understood before concluding. Across Houston, evening lights gradually illuminated homes, churches, and neighborhoods where ordinary people continued living ordinary lives, unaware that one quiet afternoon had transformed the hearts of everyone fortunate enough to witness it. As mother and son slowly drove away beneath the deepening twilight, neither of them looked back. They did not need to. The promise had been kept, forgiveness had found its place, and somewhere between misunderstanding and compassion, another generation had quietly learned that true honor is never created by power, but by the simple courage to treat every person with dignity before knowing anything about their name, their family, or their story. Several weeks passed, and the extraordinary afternoon quietly became part of Houston's memory, not because newspapers continued writing about it, but because the people who had witnessed it carried its lesson into their everyday lives. The city looked exactly as it always had. Morning traffic flowed across familiar highways. Children hurried toward school with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Neighbors greeted one another while walking dogs beneath tall oak trees. Life continued without ceremony, yet something had quietly changed inside the hearts of those whose paths had crossed with Margaret Johnson. Sergeant Brian Walker noticed the change first within himself. Every morning before beginning his shift, he paused for a few moments inside the station parking lot before walking through the front doors. He reminded himself that every call involved real people carrying stories invisible to strangers. During training sessions with newly assigned officers, he encouraged them to slow down long enough to listen completely before reaching conclusions. He often repeated that evidence deserved patience and people deserved dignity, even during moments of uncertainty. Those simple words gradually became part of the culture inside the precinct, not because they appeared inside official manuals, but because they had been learned through experience that no classroom could ever duplicate. Across town, Margaret Johnson quietly returned to the life she loved most. Every Tuesday she prepared breakfast for elderly veterans at the neighborhood church exactly as she had done for years. Every Thursday she organized donated clothing for struggling families. Every Saturday afternoon she welcomed children into the public library reading room with warm smiles and patient stories. Nothing about her routine changed after that remarkable day. She never introduced herself as the mother of a famous military leader. She never mentioned government vehicles or official apologies. To her, kindness remained meaningful only when it expected nothing in return. General Ethan Johnson returned to his military responsibilities carrying a lesson that no ceremony could ever equal. During leadership meetings, he occasionally reminded younger officers that authority carried its greatest value only when joined with humility. He never spoke about the afternoon in detail. Instead, he encouraged every future leader to remember that the people standing quietly before them often possessed extraordinary character long before anyone discovered their accomplishments. His words spread quietly through conversations, classrooms, and commands, shaping leaders who would never know exactly where those lessons first began. One peaceful autumn evening, Ethan drove to his mother's modest brick home after completing another demanding week. The front porch looked exactly as it had throughout his childhood. Two old wooden rocking chairs faced the quiet neighborhood while soft porch lights illuminated framed family photographs visible through the front window. Margaret welcomed her son with a gentle smile before placing 2 warm cups of tea upon the small wooden table between them. Together they sat watching colorful leaves drift slowly across the yard while neighborhood children laughed somewhere in the distance. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable, filled with years of trust rather than empty words. Finally, Ethan thanked his mother for teaching him that the greatest victories were rarely celebrated in public. Margaret smiled softly before answering that every person would eventually leave behind something far more valuable than wealth, titles, or recognition. They would leave behind the way they made other people feel. She looked toward the quiet street as the final light disappeared beyond the trees and whispered that every stranger deserved the chance to be understood before being judged. Ethan quietly nodded, knowing those simple words had guided every meaningful decision of his life. The rocking chairs continued moving gently beneath the evening sky while the warm porch light reflected softly across the family photographs inside the window. No applause interrupted the silence. No cameras recorded the moment. Only the peaceful sound of autumn leaves carried through the neighborhood, leaving behind a quiet reminder that real honor is never measured by the stars upon a uniform, but by the compassion carried within an ordinary heart long before the world ever learns its name.